Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. It's time for another retro TV feature. Today we're going to go back to the 1960s, that great era of imaginative, filmed, quite lavish adventure shows generated by ITC and financed by the late great Sir Lew Grade. He made these shows with an eye on sales to the American markets, particularly the American networks. Very hard to get a British series on the American network. Happened in the 60s, but the shows weren't always huge successes. But ITC created all these shows. I've spoken of them in the past, and I've done features on some of them, and we'll do features on more of them. We're talking about Randall Hopkirk, The Baron, The Prisoner, Department S, and one particular show which isn't as well remembered as perhaps it should be, but there may be reasons for that. We'll discuss that shortly. But today I'm talking about the exploits of Sharon McCready, Craig Sterling, and Richard Barrett, the champions of law, order, and justice. Yes, welcome back. Champions was created by Dennis Spooner. Dennis Spooner is one of the great creative minds of the 1960s TV and the 1970s. He died tragically early in his early 50s. But in the 60s, he worked on lots of Gerry Anderson shows. He was the second script editor for Doctor Who, and he was the script editor who broadened Doctor Who's remit slightly. He pushed the boundaries of what the show could do by taking it into weird places and taking it into comedic places. And he really stretched that format almost to breaking point in his time on Doctor Who. He wrote lots of comedy scripts. You'll remember his Doctor Who script for The Romans, which is practically a pantomime. He did some very amusing stuff for Gerry Anderson shows like Fireball XL5 and Stingray. He brought wit and real imagination to these shows. And he created the Champions because he was aware of, and I think he'd enjoyed, superhero comics from DC and Marvel, Superman, Batman, possibly Spider-Man, and he thought it would be an interesting idea to transplant that idea of superpowered humans into an adult drama adventure series, and thus he created the Champions. In the first episode, The Beginning, which is frankly one of the best episodes, which Spooner himself wrote, we see our three heroes, Craig, Sharon and Richard, on a mission for their organisation Nemesis. They work for this organisation which is an Interpol type organisation based in Geneva, where they investigate strange crimes, espionage and sabotage, anything that goes beyond the remit of local crime investigation organisation. They're already on a mission. They're in China. They're in a laboratory complex trying to get hold of some top secret material. Escaping from the complex, their plane is shot down and crashes in the Himalayas. They are mortally injured, but they are rescued by a bunch of Shangri-La type llamas who imbue them with strange abilities, which they then use to repel the attack of Chinese soldiers who've been sent out to finish them off. Their abilities include telepathy, precognition, super strength, agility, and then going forward they use these new abilities in their missions for Nemesis. 30 episodes of The Champions were made. It started in the UK in September 1968. There's a lot of episodes, just one series unfortunately, because it didn't take off, and it didn't take off in America. I suspect again it wasn't networked in America, which meant Lew Grade wouldn't necessarily have been minded to finance any more episodes, despite how well the show might have done in the UK, and I think it did quite well in the UK. The problem with The Champions, watching it now, and I watched a few episodes in preparation for this video, is that it is very unlike the other ITC shows. They're all very glossy, but they all have some humanity and some humour to them. Think of something like Randall Hopkirk, which has a great vein of humour running through it, mainly due to the great chemistry between Mike Pratt, Kenneth Cope and Annette Andre. It's set in late 1960s London. You see London, you see the seedy side of London, but there's great wit and rapport between the lead characters and a great sense of humanity. And whilst by the nature of ITC shows there was very little in the way of proper character development and nothing in the way of continuing narratives, because these shows were all made to be shown out of order. As long as you showed the first episode, which established the setting of the series, networks and syndicated channels could show the episodes in any order that they wanted. So there was no sense of serialization as we get on TV today, which is why none of these series ever show any real sense of character development. They never learn anything or change. The last episode, they are much the same as they were in the first. They've just had lots of adventures, but they never refer to any of those. There's no continuity. There's very little sense of growth. But that sort of didn't matter because that's the way the TV was at the time. But what we had in many of the ITC shows was a little bit of levity and a little bit of humour. As I said, Randall Hobkirk was very amusing. The Saint, Roger Moore always brought a twinkle in anything that he did, and the Saint often had little jokey bits and bits of humour here and there to lighten the drama. Department S, which I will be doing at some point, had the character of Jason King, who was this larger-than-life author of lurid spy thrillers, who brought a bit of flamboyance and wit and humour to what was quite a staid sort of, if imaginative, series. Champions, however, has none of this. The Champions is very, very po-faced and very straight-laced. We've got our three lead characters, and we don't really learn anything about them at all across the whole series. There's very little rapport between them. They all share the same experience, they all share the same powers, but there's no discussion about this between them. They share little looks at one another. Yeah, we can do this, we can do that. But they never talk about it, and they never share their experiences. And there is apparently background to the characters, and that Craig Sterling is supposed to be a pilot, Richard Barrett is a code breaker, and Sharon McCready is a doctor and a scientist. She's supposed to have been recently widowed. But you never really get a sense of this in the episodes. Now, I'll bow to superior knowledge maybe of people who have seen all the episodes recently. Perhaps there are references to these things in later episodes. Certainly in the 6 or 7 episodes I've watched, I don't know anything about these people, except that the men wear suits, Sharon McCready wears nice female clothes, and they go off and have adventures, and they do little things here and there, and then they come back, and they share a sly look at one another. Their boss, Tremaine, played by Anthony Nichols, he always looks at them and thinks, how do you manage to do this? And they sort of look at one another with their little secret. But there's nothing else to them as characters, and that's frustrating. The stories are largely quite interesting. Some of them are a bit dreary. Some of them are slightly boring espionage stories. There's little of the imagination that you would expect from somebody like Dennis Spooner. But through all these adventures, you get these three characters who are just so bloody drab. There's no real sense that there are real people. They do what they do. They go through the motions. They have their adventures. They use their powers occasionally, and it is occasionally. But there's nothing to make you latch onto them or like them as people, because they have no personality. And it is very frustrating, because this is a great idea that they could have done so much more with. And I just feel watching this, why don't you just let yourself go? Particularly Dennis Spooner, I keep going back to him as this imaginative writer who knew how to balance humour and drama, but that's all out of the window here. Now, admittedly, he didn't write all the episodes, but some of them are written by quite experienced writers who'd done a lot of work for ITC and done a lot of work for a lot of shows in the 60s. Terry Nation, who created the Daleks, wrote several episodes. You've got people like Donald James, Philip Broadley, Gerald Kelsey. These are all names quite well known in 60s TV shows. But they're all writing to this formula of setting up quite a often drab story about something being smuggled or something being stolen. And one or more of the characters is put in danger. The others have to try and find that other character. And then eventually there's a bit of a punch-up at the end with some bad guys, a little display of heroism and superpowers by our heroes. And they all end up smiling at one another in Tremaine's office as he goes, how did you do that? It's a formula, and it's a shame, because this doesn't need to be a formula series. This could have been a series that was much more exciting if they just played into those characters, or done something with the characters. Stories themselves are the usual mix. For budgetary reasons, you get a lot of reused sets and locations. There are, I think, 3 episodes set in sort of Arctic locations, which sort of allows them to reuse some of the props from the first episode. I think there are 3 episodes set on a submarine and 3 set in a jungle. A lot of interiors. There's an episode called Happening, which is set in a desert landscape where there's a nuclear bomb that's possibly going to go off. So you can see that it was, even though it's a big, colourful film series, you can see the budgetary restraints in certain places. But what I like about all these shows from the 60s really is that you get some nice location scenes in and around London. And it's always nice to see London back in the 60s before it became this big nightmare cityscape, choked with cars and people. You see people driving around and parking their cars in the streets, and it just seems like a slightly smaller London than the one we're so used to seeing these days. And there is quite a lot of exterior stuff. I think they did go abroad for at least one episode to do some filming. And what's also interesting is you get to see some great actors, some great old British character actors turning up. I think anybody who is anybody appears in an episode of The Champions throughout the run of the series. I'm just looking at some of the guest cast who appeared in just a handful of the episodes. We had Peter Wyngarde, who of course would go on to appear in Department S the following year, I think. He appears in the second episode. Interestingly, David Prowse, Darth Vader himself, appears in the second episode. Anton Rogers appears. Nicholas Courtney, the Brigadier from Doctor Who, turns up. Michael Gough, the Celestial Toymaker from Doctor Who, and later Batman's Butler Alfred in the Tim Burton Batman films, he appears. Patrick Wymark appeared. Clifford Evans, Donald Houston, Kate O'Mara, Stephen Burkoff, a legendary figure of modern theatre, appeared in an episode. Andrew Keir, Vladek Sheybal, Julian Glover, Gerald Harper, Mike Pratt, Joseph First, who a couple of years earlier had been threatening that nothing in the world can stop me now in Doctor Who's The Underwater Menace, John Woodvine, Reginald Marsh, Hannah Gordon, William Franklin. I mean, the whole British acting fraternity appeared in these episodes, and that sort of is interesting in itself, because as somebody who's grew up in that era, I recognise a lot of those actors who appeared in so many shows. And it's good to see them turning up in these shows, because it just reminds you of the extraordinary careers that these jobbing actors had. They weren't necessarily all star names, but they appeared in episodic television, and ITC generated a lot of episodic television. I do like The Champions. It's fun to watch, but there is this constant nagging feeling, oh God, this could be so much better than this. There could be so much more life and so much imagination to it. I'm not saying it needs aliens and monsters and all that sort of stuff, but I think the stories could have perhaps dug a little bit deeper than some of its slightly, frankly, mundane storylines. Some of the best episodes are ones that look at the characters' powers a little bit. There's an episode called The Experiment, I think it's the fourth one in the transmission run, where Sharon is sent undercover to a training establishment in which a scientist is using new techniques to produce agents who have the same kind of abilities that the Champions have. And this scientist, who's played by David Bower, I'll mention him again later, he knows that Sharon McCready certainly has abilities, and he wants to find out where she got them from, but she can't say. She won't give up the secret of where they got their powers from. And episodes like that are interesting because they at least probe a little bit into who these people are and why they are what they are. But otherwise, it's very much the stuff of most of these sorts of things. There's an episode called The Fanatics, written by Terry Nation, which is about an organisation that's assassinating international leaders. The Gilded Cage, burglars break into Nemesis headquarters to access information on Richard. Craig is assigned to monitor him. Richard, however, allows himself to be abducted, leaving a message for his colleague. It's all that sort of thing, and it could have been a lot more than that. I just wish the stories had had bigger villains than Nazis and spies and smugglers and people stealing top secrets. It could have had proper villains, proper big, larger-than-life baddies. It's a show that never comes close, really, to meeting its potential, because the stories are just the stuff of interchangeable with Department S, The Saint. Any of these sorts of shows could have had stories like these. But it is an interesting series, and there's lots of interesting little things about it. I mean, you will remember that marvellous Tony Hatch theme music, which is a sort of a jazzy, easy listening piece, and that iconic title sequence with our heroes in front of the fountain at Lake Geneva, turning and looking at each other, which is something they did a lot in the series. And particularly remember the little vignettes that you would have after the title sequence. These were narrated by David Bower, who appeared in that episode, The Experiment. And he was one of those actors who was always playing mid-European scientists, and they were always talking like this. And these vignettes would introduce our characters week by week, and it would show them doing something. There's one where Richard and Craig are in a gym and they're lifting some weights, and a big weightlifter comes in. That's David Prowse. He comes in and lifts up some weights quite easily and looks at them, and they're quite happily tossing these weights between them because they're super strong. And there's another one where Sharon pulls her car out of a parking space by using her own super strength. This is all rather odd because the whole point of these characters is that they keep their powers secret and nobody knows about them, but they don't seem to mind displaying them in public now and again. But that's by the by. It's a sort of quirk of this type of storytelling, where they didn't necessarily think in terms of the overarching concept of the thing. It's about getting it on the screen and making it look interesting. And the thing about their powers is also quite frustrating, because they have these powers, but they don't do much with them, really. You know, you see them occasionally jumping over a fence, or snapping their bonds if they've been captured, or punching somebody, or smashing a lock. You don't get much in the way of them being actually superhuman. You don't see them doing incredible things, which is a shame. But that's because we are never really told what the limits of their powers are. You know, could they jump off a building? Could they jump off a cliff? We certainly see in one episode, at least, Craig is able to hold his breath underwater for quite a long time. But that's just in that episode. Another episode, he is shot and thrown out of a plane. He swims to shore to a tropical island. So he's obviously got great swimming abilities. These all are things that are just thrown into episodes for the purposes of this particular episode, this particular story. It is a shame that there isn't more made of their powers, so we know a bit more about what they actually can do and what the limits of what they can do are. They're never tested beyond their limits. In terms of the main cast, I mean, it's a good-looking cast. Craig is played by American actor Stuart Damon, obviously cast for that with that eye on the American market. He's a good, sturdy, solid macho male figure. He's the one who's good with his fists. You've got William Gaunt, great British actor who went on to appear in lots of BBC sitcoms, made an appearance in Doctor Who in 1984. He's the code breaker. He's a bit cool and calm, and he's the one who sort of holds Craig back when he tries to lurch into situations without thinking them through. And then we get Sharon, played by Alexandra Bastido. She's the weak link in the chain, frankly. She's not a great actress. What can you say? She delivers her lines quite flatly. There's not a lot of expression. There's not much tone to her delivery. She's very flat. She is, I suppose, the clothes horse that you would have, a female glamour figure that you'd have in these series. But they're a team who work quite well together. After the show ended, Stuart Damon went back to the States, and he worked for many, many years on well-known daytime soap opera General Hospital. And he became pretty much a superstar from that role in America, even though the show, I don't think, has ever been shown over here. He passed away a couple of years ago. William Gaunt is still with us. Alexandra Bastido passed away a few years ago. Her career, I think she drifted more into modelling a little bit, but certainly towards the end of her career, I do seem to remember her turning up in Absolutely Fabulous with Jennifer Saunders and John Lumley. But I think between them, they're an attractive bunch, shall we say, and they carry the roles as well as they need to. Must have been frustrating for them as actors just not to have much to work with. But that is the enduring frustration with the series. And it's probably the reason that The Champions isn't as well remembered as perhaps it could have been, and certainly some of its contemporaries are, because I think it's a great idea that's not developed well enough with characters who aren't developed at all. I think with slightly more imaginative scripts and better developed characters, it's a show that people would remember a bit better than they do today, because it's a bit faceless, it's a bit bland. It is an entertaining show because it's of that era when these shows had that sort of naivety about them, and it's charming to watch it. It did have an afterlife. I mean, it only ran for one series, but it was on the networks for years and years. You would turn up on afternoons on various ITV networks. It was rescreened again in the 90s on BBC Two when cult television became a thing. And it's turned up more recently on things like Talking Pictures over the last few years. In terms of sort of exploitation at the time, there was, I think, one paperback book based on a couple of episodes of the series. There was a comic strip which ran in the Joe 90 comic, the short-lived Joe 90 comic from Jerry Anderson. I think it ran from issues 1 to issue 34, because I think that comic only lasted 34 issues. But there was a 2-page Champions comic strip, and there was also a comic strip, a Joe 90 annual. There was an afterlife as well in a strange way, because in 1972, a UK comic published by, I think it was IPC, called Core, had a comic strip called The Champions, which was so clearly based on The Champions. I think The Champions was, as I say, probably still being screened. So kids would have been aware of it and would know of it, which is why it was still being referenced 4 years after it was made. This is quite an amusing comic strip about 3 kids, Dot, Lofty and Tubby. They meet up with a llama, which I think makes that connection with The Champions even stronger. They give him a fruit and a nut for some reason, and he decides to imbue them with incredible powers. Dot can stretch herself, Lofty has magnetic powers, and Tubby can turn himself into a ball. The character of the llama appears in every episode of the comic strip, and he has a fondness for yak butter sandwiches. This is a strip which ran for a few years, and it sort of lasted longer than the Champions itself in a way, which probably says something about the Champions. So anyway, that's the Champions. But even that wasn't really the end of the Champions, and despite the fact that it's a show that you think, well, it sort of came and went, people clearly remembered it because there have been efforts to reboot it and reimagine it for years. In 2007, it was said that Guillermo del Toro himself would produce and write a film adaptation of the series for United Artists. 2008, Christopher McQuarrie, the genius behind the Mission Impossible films at the moment, he was signed to co-write and co-produce a film based on the Champions. What if Tom Cruise would have been in it? More recently, in 2021, Ben Stiller was said to be on board to star in and direct a film with Kate Blanchett co-starring. It was going to be produced by New Republic Pictures, and in fact there's even a big press release about it with Kate Blanchett saying how excited she was to help regenerate this classic TV series. Nothing has come to any of these projects. They all fell by the wayside. Why? Well, that's the vagaries of Hollywood for you. And possibly it's because at the end of the day there's a fault somewhere in the format of the Champions, which makes it very difficult to bring back to life. But certainly if you watch the series again now, it's available on this DVD box set. I mean, probably isn't available now because it's from Network, who went bust ages ago, but I'm sure you can still find it online, and it's all on ITC'S if you fancy watching it. I think if you watch it, you will enjoy it because it's of that era, and if you enjoy that sort of cult classic TV, you'll get a lot out of it. But I think that, like me, you will notice the differences between the other shows, which had a bit of light and shade, a bit of humour here and there. This is very po-faced, very poker-faced, very straight-laced and stiff. And if it only did loosen up a little bit, I think people would remember it a bit more fondly, and I think it would have been a bigger hit than it was at the time. That's The Champions, a classic ITC show. If you remember The Champions, if you've seen it recently, if you've been watching it, let me know what you think. Do you have fond memories of it? Do you agree with me that it is not quite the sum of its parts? Or did you think it was a fantastic show that should have run and ran and should be remade? Let me know what you think. Leave a comment down below. While you're doing that, like and subscribe to the channel. It doesn't cost you a thing. 65% of people who watch videos aren't subscribed, which seems crazy to me. So why not like and subscribe to this channel if you've enjoyed this video? Press that subscribe button. It's a subscription, but it doesn't cost you anything. I'm not Netflix. I think you know that. It doesn't cost you a penny. So just click that subscribe button. You will see new videos as they appear. You don't have to watch them. You can pick and choose. You can go look back through my playlist of stuff that I've done over the last 3 or 4 years. You might find something that interests you. And if you don't, well, at least you hear when things turn up that you are interested in. So like, subscribe, leave a comment. I'll see you soon until I do. Keep taking the stuff.